Hello and welcome to the Institute for Government for this event, which we're delighted to be holding in partnership with the City Corporation. We've been having excellent collaboration with the City on a series of events about Brexit. Some of you will have been here last month to hear Pascal Lamy talk, give us a bit of perspective about how difficult the negotiations could be. What we're hoping to do in the next hour is hear concrete proposals from our very distinguished panel on how best to run the upcoming negotiations. I'm Jill Rutter, I'm Programme Director here and overseeing our Brexit work programme. Bronwyn Maddox unfortunately had an accident while walking in Spain. She is all right, but she can't be with us today, so that's why I'm substituting for her. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce our panel. To my immediate right, I have the Right Honourable Gisela Stewart, MP. She's a Labour MP, Chair of Change Britain. You will know, obviously, Chair of the Vote Leave campaign, whatever. She also, though, has experience of negotiating in Europe, having been involved in the development of the European Constitution, the Giscard d'Estaing project. So she has experience on the inside as well as from very excellent parliamentary perspective she's going to be able to bring today. Then I'm delighted to have on my far left Sir Stephen Wall. Stephen is a very well-known Euro-expert. He's former UK permanent representative to the EU, has been European and Global Issues advisors to Prime Ministers and Private Secretary at Number 10 during other sort of tortured negotiations. So he brings an immense amount of EU and Whitehall experience, as indeed does his neighbour, Sir Andrew Kahn, former head of UK Trade and Investment, and also was chef de cabinet to Lord Kinnock. So he's been sort of in and out of Whitehall and Europe and is now a governor of the Institute for Government, which is a very important role as well. And finally, absolutely delighted that we're joined by Mark Boliat. Mark has been one of the sort of prime proponents of our partnership between IFG and the City. He's chair of the City of London Corporation's Policy and Resources Committee. So the format today is no set speeches. I've got a few questions I'm going to get the panel to kick around, but more importantly, we want you to be ready and primed to go. We've got an hour for this to make sure you can all be back at your desks, and very importantly, Gisela Stewart can be back in the House of Commons to find out whether indeed or not the Prime Minister successfully triggers the election using the provisions of the Fixed Term Parliament Act. If you want to know how that works, my colleague Catherine Haddon is lurking around. But she needs to be back for that vote, which is scheduled at 2. I hope you're on some sort of bleeper if the debate falls short and it's sooner than that. So we're going to kick off. So what I just wanted to get all our panel to think about first up was we're now in April. We saw this sort of flurry of activity at the end of March. We saw the text of the Prime Minister's letter to Donald Tusk. We saw the draft guidelines by the Council. We saw the European Parliament resolution on what should be in those on those guidelines obviously for formal adoption at the European Council on the 29th of April. So where do you think we are as a starting point? Gisela Stewart, where do you think things are looking now, and perhaps maybe compared to where they might have been before we saw the Tusk letter and the EC guidelines?
I think there's beginning to be a recognition that these negotiations are about politics and not physics. I.e., it's not a question of that you have to try and redefine the laws of gravity, which are immovable, but this is political will, which can make things as easy and as difficult as you want them to be. And I think we're beginning to a crystallization as to what are the immovable objects. And I think one of the biggest one is essentially, if you go back in your history, what was the difference between the common market and EFTA? It was people, movement of people. And the movement of people was meant to be the politically integrating thing which took it beyond trade. So I think we have to accept that this is just something they will not give way on because it completely undermines the founding principle. But I think there's a kind of stock taking going on, and it would require I think Theresa May inside Number 10 have, and by the way, 48 hours ago, I would have said the British don't play poker. The one thing about the Brits is that they're terribly predictable when they go into negotiations. All that she's thrown out of the window. I also would have said that the British have a real tradition, and Stephen Ball will know much more about that, of clearing things across Whitehall before you go in, so you know you've got your back covered. I'm not sure whether any of this applies. However, I think over the next 6 weeks of the election campaign, she will have to crystallize as to what success is. So when I negotiated the constitution, and because I was a parliamentary representative, my three things were removal of the word ever closer union, a clause that would allow powers to go up and down, and a clause which would allow to leave. And within that, I thought the rest is negotiable. For her, it has to go back off. You have to take back control over your law, your trade, and your borders. You need an immigration policy that is based on merit and not geography. And she has to break the automaticity of payments into the European Union. And I think she may do more or less, but I would have thought that that's the things which so it's next 6 weeks, she has to crystallize how she will define success.
So that's very interesting on the UK side. Stephen, reading the EU guidelines as a sort of, well-known, I don't know what the Brussels equivalent of a criminologist is, but looking at those, what do you think they told us maybe that we didn't quite know before about where the EU's real sticking points were?
Well, in a slightly longer form, they reaffirm exactly what the EU heads of government said immediately after the referendum, in particular about the four freedoms being indivisible, and therefore access to the single market depending on acceptance of freedom of movement, among other things. I think there are some interesting things in the guidelines. One which is helpful to us is that there will be a single package and that nothing is agreed till everything is agreed, because that does mean that unless we choose to, and I think an election may make it easier for Theresa May not to choose to, unless we choose to have a bust-up over the amount of money we owe on leaving, we don't have to get that necessarily resolved definitively until part of a final package. And if that's the case, that works for us. But there are two very clear things in the guidelines, which I don't think got a great deal of attention. One, it repeats the European Council stands ready to initiate work towards such an agreement, i.e. an agreement on the future relationship, to be finalised and concluded once the United Kingdom is no longer a member state. And then later on, while an agreement on a future relationship between the Union and the United Kingdom as such can only be concluded once the UK has become a third country, nonetheless, work can start. And the logic of that has been that it's, I think, compelled Theresa May to accept something which she was telling her officials she did not accept only 3 weeks ago, but she accepted it in the Article 50 letter, that there has to be a transition. And that's going to be the real nub, I think, of how we manage. I mean, we're going to get to a point, if the government stick to their line, where this time, 2 years' time, we will have left the European Union. But what is the nature of that transition? How do we manage it? And that's going to be as crucial the part of the negotiation as anything else.
So, of course, one of the interesting things about the election is it gives her the transition, sort of longer potential transition before she has to face the electorate again. So I think that's sort of very interesting, the coming acceptance. Andrew, what's your reading? Do you have a sort of, anything to add to what Stephen's interpreted from both sides' letters?
I think what I'd say is that the government made a really rather poor start to these negotiations, and now they've got their act together and are in a much better position. Early on, they made a whole series of what I'd say were beginners' mistakes. So Theresa May gave away 3 points which she should have negotiated. She gave away the point about when she would invoke Article 50. She should have got something in return for that. She said red lines which she didn't need to do. And she said she didn't want to be in the single market or in the customs union, even if that was in her position. She got nothing in return for those 3 things, all of which, in a way, were concessions. So I think early on things didn't go well, and it's perhaps understandable. The previous administration had made no preparation. One of the great failings of a government, I think, in my career, no preparation at all. So this new administration found itself starting from scratch. They then imposed new departments which had to get their act together, and they had to find people to do the negotiations. So perhaps it isn't surprising it was a poor start. But I think the government has got its act together. I think the Article 50 letter was right in tone. I think it was well drafted. I remember somebody saying to me, it should be a 2-sentence letter. Well, that wasn't right. It was a good letter. It was well judged, and clearly there had been behind the scenes talking, because that letter and the draft guidelines do mesh quite well. So again, always important. That letter should not have been a surprise to the recipient, and I don't think it was. I don't even agree with the critics who say that the hint about security and defence.
It's a bit more than a hint, wasn't it, in that paragraph?
You see, I interpreted it slightly. I mean, when you have very few negotiating cards, you do have to play the ones you have. And I think the way to interpret that is Britain saying to the EU 27, if you choose to impoverish us, well, that's all very well. But if you do impoverish us, we can't play our role within Europe, our security and defence role, as well as you would like us to. It's simply a reality. And in the same way, if you choose to impoverish us, make sure that we are a diminished nation economically, well, we'll have to think how we get out of that. And so perhaps we will have to have economic policies you don't like. I think actually it's perfectly reasonable things to say, and you know, the EU show a sign of weakness, of nervousness in making a lot of noise about it.
So if you'd been Permanent Secretary at DEXU, Andrew, which wouldn't have been beyond the band's possibility if this all happened 10 years ago, you would have been perfectly relaxed, would you, about having to offer a clarification within a day of what the Prime Minister was trying to say on trade and security?
I think, well, I think it was inevitable, because the letter didn't say what some of the EU, the critics said it said. Yeah. And so perhaps it needed a clarification, but I wouldn't have felt uneasy about that. I think you've got to get your messages across to the other side, and you've got to say it's bad for both sides if we have a breakdown. It's bad for both sides if Britain crashes out, and there will be consequences, bad consequences for us, but bad consequences for you. Don't let's go there.
Stephen, I'm just on the draft now. I'm going to come to Mark about the external perspective. Did you think it was well drafted, the letter?
On the whole, yes. I mean, that particular bit, I mean, I was told by a reliable source, who should obviously remain nameless, that particular language about our ability or inability to continue the kind of cooperation on justice and home affairs kind of issues had been even tougher and got toned down, which does suggest that the intention to make it sound menacing was clearly there. But it is also, as Andrew said, it is also actually a reflection of reality. If you have a negotiation that doesn't succeed, then in particular that would include not maintaining the mechanisms by which we do share intelligence. And so maintaining the mechanisms is actually very much part of it.
So Mark, the sort of external reader of both the Tusk letter and what was in the EU guidelines, where did you think we were starting off from? Did you think this was a sort of better position than you might have expected, or?
Better talk about lowering expectations. So can I lower expectations that I've got much to add? Because I agree with what the three previous speakers have said to a large extent. I think we're in a better place than we were 3 or 4 weeks ago. I think the Article 50 letter was as good as it could have been, bearing in mind where we are. It did lower expectations quite significantly in a number of areas. We're no longer hearing about having our cake and eating it. There's a recognition that there are some costs associated with leaving the European Union, as well as benefits. And I think one that's already got a bit of prominence is the move of the European Medicines Agency, where some people feel outraged at how dare Europe move the European Medicines Agency to the European Union. This is outrageous. It should stay in Britain. You know, there's a very heavy cost to our pharmaceutical industry and to the economy from that. So a recognition that there are some costs is good. Really good that there's an acceptance of a transition period, but Stephen, we're not allowed to call it that. It is called an implementation period, because I think there was a fear that transition meant transition, we're not leaving, implementation means after we've left. So there needs to be a great flag lowering ceremony, if not a flag burning ceremony. Flag lowering. When we finally leave, and then we can have an implementation period. I thought the response was equally good, and I'm reassured to hear that probably there was a bit of collaboration on the two documents. I thought it was as good as it could have been. It recognises the scope for some parallel negotiations on the new arrangement, even though technically you can't agree one till you finish the other. So I think that is all looking pretty good. I think probably the election will be helpful in that it will enable a better transition arrangement. However, calling an election is always a bit of a gamble. I do recall an Australian Prime Minister who did this some years ago, thinking he had a very weak opposition leader, which was correct. Sadly, the very weak opposition leader immediately resigned, and the result wasn't quite as anticipated.
I think he was taken out.
I'm sure that's not going to happen on this occasion.
Now there's an idea.
Your idea, not mine.
The Australians' ability to get rid of political leaders is second to none. So I think that's not what we're discussing today, though we're happy to have another event on that if people think that's a good idea. So just coming back to our two sort of resident former bureaucrats here. When we had an event 6 weeks ago with Sarah Healy, who's the DG at the Department of Exiting the EU, James Landale from the BBC said, so actually, how do you set about preparing the negotiations? What actually are you aiming to do in Whitehall to sort of get these up and running and service that sort of 2-year period? So, Stephen, if you were advising the Prime Minister, somebody calls you in and says, you know, how should I actually organise this? How do I get Whitehall to prepare? How might they use the next 6 weeks really constructively to hit the ground running when a new government is back? What would you be doing?
Well, I think one of the things they have needed, and I think have rather turned their face against, is bringing in expertise. I mean, I know at least 2 former colleagues with lots of EU experience whose offer of help was rejected, and one very current senior civil servant whose offer of help was rejected, on the basis that if your face doesn't fit, you don't get into the room, and that's daft. It's simply daft. We know, and Andrew can talk more about it, about the lack of expertise on trade issues. I think the real issue, and if Theresa May comes back with an increased majority, it'll be easier for this to happen, is to have, I mean, the work of civil servants is rightly always constrained by the politics. And if the politics have been, as they were until very recently, we're not even going to talk about a transition, then they can't actually do the work. But how do you, managing an implementation period, getting to the end of negotiations and not falling off the cliff, what is the process by which you go from one set of arrangements to another one? That I hope the ability will be there for the civil servants to do the work. I mean, I know in the Treasury they are starting to do that work because Philip Hammond rightly, sensibly, has seen the need for that. That's the main thing. It's actually a matter of working through where you want to end up and how do you actually get there. But the Prime Minister and the government have to decide where they are prepared. And we know where they want to end up. But the mechanisms for getting there are going to require some compromises, and they have at least to think about those compromises. They may decide they're not prepared to make them, but they have at least to think realistically about them. Because when it comes to that point, if we want to maintain for a transitional period exactly the same kind of trade relationship that we have now, i.e. not with tariffs and so on and so forth, while we work out a new regime, then there are going to have to be things at least thought about, like how do you adjudicate that, for example, and what do you allow in terms of freedom of movement, etc., etc.
So Andrew,
I'd make 2 comments. Firstly, I think the government has 3 comments. The government has actually set up a structure which is working reasonably well after, as I say, a hesitant start, and the civil servants, I think, are doing good work. You know, deciding what the dossiers are, going out and talking to interest groups, people like Mark and many others, and trying to sort of define the nature of the negotiation, and no doubt planning also on trade-offs. 2 things I think they should be doing, which from the outside I'm not sure they are. The first is, like Stephen, I do think they should be getting in people with real expertise, even if they are to have no power. As an example, we're going to have an agricultural support policy. We haven't had that since 1973. I happened to join the Ministry of Agriculture in 1973, and I and a whole bunch of other old stages.
I think you're not quite old enough, Andrew.
Not quite old enough. But I do know some people who know what a deficiency payments scheme system means, who understand, do you want to have a milk marketing board, a potato marketing board? Do you want to have those things or don't you? Who know what a system of monetary compensatory amounts are, which we're going to need to have, something like that. So there's a huge amount of expertise out there which could be harnessed, and there is a sort of seems to be a dogmatic philosophy which said anybody who is from the past and has been associated with the European Union, who may be a Remainer, is beyond the pale. And I just think that's childish. I think they should have got over that. After all, the Prime Minister says that the country is coming together. If it's coming together, well, she should be using that expertise. The second thing that I think the government should be doing is building on what Stephen says. There does need to be some mechanism for taking for coordination, for taking the difficult decisions. Stephen and I, in our time, were both closely involved in the Cabinet Office machinery for knocking the heads of departments together and deciding what the trade-off should be and what the government position should be. At the moment, what appears to happen is that it all goes into the black box of number 10, stays there for quite a long time, and then obiter dicta come out from number 10.
So we do seem to now have this...
That isn't a good system. Of course, at the end of the day, the really big, the really difficult decisions on trade-offs will have to be taken by the Prime Minister, and it has to happen in the black box of number 10. But there are thousands of other decisions which need to be taken. Number 10 can't do it all, so there needs to be a coordinating mechanism of some sort which does the triage, and it doesn't seem to exist at the moment.
Well, she has set up this Brexit negotiation subcommittee with Philip Hammond, Amber Rudd, and Boris Johnson,
but you need,
not Liam Fox.
I'm sorry, I sound like the Sir Humphrey, but you do need to have an official process underpinning that to feed the choices up to the ministers, so the ministers can.
And
then
do you think that doesn't exist at the moment? That that's not one of the things that DEXU is doing?
It can't because it isn't sitting on top of it. It's a player itself. But DEXU there needs to be a mechanism which says the Department of Agriculture wants one thing, but the Department for International Trade wants another. I mean, agriculture versus trade is the Commerce Department is a classic tension that always exists. At some point, that trade-off has to be made, and I don't think that the DEXU is the one to do it.
Oh, right, that's interesting, because DEXU does see itself as a coordinating department rather than, I mean, it's obviously one of the issues about did you set up a new department or did you not, that we discussed when we looked at it, and when we came down on the side of not setting up a new department and just expanding that function in the Cabinet Office. But they do see themselves as playing that role, I think. But
well, I don't think they've got there yet.
You don't think they've got there yet. So, Gisela, about Parliament. I mean, Parliament has, the European Parliament's been told it will get lots of information about the process of negotiation. We get all these mandates published in Europe. What's Parliament's expectation of scrutiny of the negotiating process as opposed to just being told what the final deal is?
This is where collective memory actually comes in and is exceptionally important. And I think we have a Parliament that is virtually devoid of any collective memory of anything to do with the European Union. I mean, if you think about this, since 2010, there has not been a single fisheries debate, there's not been a single agriculture debate. Until 2010, we used to have ahead of the European Council meeting a whole day's debate on the European Union. That was deemed to be backbench business and wasn't brought up. And Cameron really did behave like a 4-year-old who stands in the playground and kept pretending that as long as he didn't look and pretended it wasn't happening, Europe didn't happen. So what's missing is in the collective memory over in Brussels, because it's not just coordinating in cabinet, how does the British side coordinate getting some ideas and getting traction of ideas at the Brussels level? And Stephen will remember when Tony Blair wanted the president of the council, and it was at that stage deemed to be the ABC plan, the retirement plan for Aznar, Chirac and Blair. And all the small countries were kind of absolutely up in arms. So the small countries set up this subcommittee where they would meet on a whatever morning it was. And I was seconded as an honorary Bavarian because Bavaria has a population of 11 million. I could therefore qualify as a small to attend these breakfasts. But what that sort of tells you is that it's not just this assumption that we need a process of getting ideas and over there is a perfectly formed recipient. Or they too has to be some. If you want something, how do you get traction over there? And then in terms of Parliament, I mean, when I negotiated the Constitution, Parliament was very nifty. It created a new institution of a joint committee of the House of Commons and the House of Lords to scrutinise this. It sounded fantastic, and the four of us gave evidence. And there were occasions when certain elderly gentlemen were told that they couldn't go to the loo because if they did, would be incorate, and the committee would collapse. So the problem with this is that unless you reach out much wider, or if you make it a vehicle of opposition, where I think the committee which up until the election Hilary Benn chaired, you created a really big committee. The more the members, therefore the more difficult to reach any agreement. So I think the challenge for Parliament is like sort of eating an elephant. You have to take it a bite at a time and either engage properly and come back and try and understand. But I am incredibly fearful that the collective memory to understand isn't there. And Stephen's comment early on about advice not being accepted from people who want to come back, who bring that institutional memory, I think is misguided, deeply misguided.
Yeah. Mark, are there any sort of structures being set up to sort of keep big players like the city informed of progress, so new ideas can be tested as the sort of negotiations proceed? Or is it very ad hoc?
I think it's ad hoc, but I'm not certain that's a bad thing. When we had our first meeting after the referendum with the Treasury, the senior Treasury official said, there is no process. We have no time for process. But I think they've been excellent. Yeah. I think the quality of the Treasury officials, they do know what they're talking about because they negotiated a lot of the directives, and indeed, frankly, an awful lot of the European financial regulation is British made and has benefited Britain hugely. So they know what they're talking about. I think they have engaged with all of the people they need to in a variety of different fora, from direct one-to-one contacts, say with the big American banks that don't want to reveal what they're doing precisely to the world, but they can talk in confidence. They've been very happy to come to roundtable discussions. Our International Regulatory Strategy Group, which Andrew's been at, we've had top officials at every one of the meetings, and they've been really useful. I think Dexia has got a lot better from the beginning. It was inevitably going to be difficult. But I had a really good meeting with Robin Walker and George Bridges. I thought they were absolutely on the ball. What you like about a meeting with the ministers is when they ask the right questions and probe on the difficult areas. So I think that's fine. Going forward, that's going to be a bit playing it by ear, I think. And officials generally like to be able to bounce off ideas from people who they know will give them an honest and quick and instant response. And I can recall when I used to run the Association of British Insurers, that was one of the things we could always do, and officials knew that within, if they wanted a response in 10 minutes, because they were in a meeting, they'd get one. And it would be a good representative response, and we weren't going to get members going behind our backs saying, well, no, we don't agree with that. So I think the government knows who its trusted advisors are on this, and I'm sure that to the extent they can during the negotiations, they will consult. Setting up something formal may be a good idea. It's a bit of a backstop, but a lot of it has got to be informal and very quick.
Okay, Stephen, I just wanted to ask you one question, and then we're going to go to questions. In the European guidelines, there's this word about, it's not sort of hard sequencing, it's not we have to conclude all of this and then we can start talking about the future partnership. It's this notion of sufficient progress, but quite a lot of people have been pointing out that the sufficient progress language was used in the negotiations with the Greeks on the euro, and sufficient progress in the eye of the beholder, and may not sort of, be quite what the other side thinks.
Well,
how worried are you about?
Well, I think this is one area where if the Prime Minister comes back with an increased majority, she can resist what would be the undoubted pressure from within her own party in Parliament and from some of the press to jump off the cliff because of the size of the bill. Now, I think Tusk's letter is quite clever when it says nothing is agreed till everything is agreed. That actually is helpful to us, and I think Theresa May can use that flexibility, not to accept whatever the figure is, but basically to say this is something, which you could even say we don't accept that. And I think Barnier has shifted his position already, and Barnier was very. Barnier's, I dealt with him quite a lot back in the day. He's not a trickster. He's very French. He's got a very French view of the European Union and of us, but he's not a trickster. But he had a very sort of firm sequencing idea. That's already getting some flexibility. But it does depend on us. Sometimes, especially for the Brussels machine. The Brussels machine has lived with years in which we, the Brits, have basically pulled a fast one as far as they're concerned. We've managed to get ourselves an exceptional position. We're not in the euro, we're not in Schengen, we've got a kind of special status. And they're determined to use this negotiation to show that, never again they're going to do that. So the language that we use is important. There's no point in really kind of provoking people. But I hope that if Theresa May comes back with a larger majority, that she can get through that issue. If we can get through that issue without having a breakdown, then we will actually get on to the rest of the negotiation, including you can't actually start really look at the terms on which you leave without starting to look at the future. The two are so inextricably linked. And I think we can get to that, probably not until after, assuming that Marine Le Pen isn't elected in France, not till after the German elections in the autumn, but after that, assuming you've got, say, Macron in France and Schulz or Merkel in Germany, then you can. And one of the advantages, it seems to me, if the Prime Minister does come back with an increased majority, it's not going to change the dynamics of the negotiation, except that, in my view, there has to be a discussion between the British Prime Minister, the French President, and the German Chancellor about what is the shape of Europe and our role in it as a big economy and as a big power. And if they're dealing with a Prime Minister who's got 4 3/4 years ahead of her, that's an advantage from her point of view.
Can I just add one small thing? You talk about the word sufficient. The EU
They talk about the word sufficient.
the EU guidelines say a sufficient progress. The European Parliament guidelines say substantial progress, which is a higher. And that shows that actually the EU, the Council guidelines are deliberately giving flexibility. And I think all the way through the guidelines, they're saying there's some things are fixed and can't be changed. So the ordering of the negotiations, the fact that it's a package, and so all those things can't be changed, and the 4 freedoms, and then the whole of the rest, flexibility is built in there. So there is a deal to be done.
We'll have to hope that doesn't change when we get the final guidelines.
We will have some
substantial.
excitements on the way to a deal.
Gisela.
Can I just add, book plug here, the guy called Paul Lever, who was was our ambassador in Berlin at the time of when our most pro-European. He's just written a book called Berlin Rules. It really is worth reading. His final conclusion is, in 20 years' time, those who voted to leave will wonder what all the fuss was all about. And he actually goes on how this is a deeply economic project, as far as the Germans are concerned. If the Germans had wanted a European army, would have had a European army by now. But the point he makes, which I think is often overlooked, is that the reason why that conversation between the French, the Germans, and the British has to happen at some stage is because once the second largest net contributor leaves the European Union, at a time when none of the other countries have got any stomach for paying more into the EU, the EU post-UK exit will largely have to define itself by the things it no longer does. Armies are expensive, but a foreign representation is cheaper. So you probably do your external on that level. And they have to think too, what do they stop doing? And never ever underestimate the deep tensions are actually always between the Germans and the French. And my experience, unless yours is different, the Brits weren't so much seen, we were seen as that Plimsoll line of things which were reasonable to do. So if even the Brits weren't accepting it, then they thought, well, we better not do it.
Okay, let's go open to question. I've got some more questions from our panel, but let's have a chance to get to you in. I'm going to take them in clumps. So let's go over here, and then we'll come to Penny. Yeah, Candice? And Penny, if you can come here. Yeah, tell us who you are.
Yeah, my name's David Banks. I'm a general sort of analyst and researcher in Brexit issues. It's just about your points regarding civil servants. Just an observation to put across to you. There were several scandals, if you like, low-grade scandals. Headlines such as Cake and Eat It, which was mentioned, Empire 2, leaks from the Treasury, and various people in the civil service briefing against Brexit. And it's almost as though in the whole tug of war, ministers look around and see some people pushing instead of pulling. And I wondered, has that changed? Are people falling into line? Are there still people in the civil service who are rooting for the other side? And how does that influence this doctrine that actually people from the 1980s and 90s with the expertise in negotiation need to be brought back in? Because they were arguably products of the Brussels machine, which put them in place in the first place.
Okay, we'll come to that, yes.
Norina Hertz, ITV News. The pound rose significantly yesterday off the back of the news that we were heading towards a general election, assuming, presumably, that a softer Brexit is now inevitable. But is it?
Okay, it's a great question. And yes, Candace, just behind you.
Robert Morland. I'm a former member of the European Parliament and the Economic and Social Committee of the EU. If I can ask something that Mark touched on, which is during the negotiations, to what extent would you feel that it will be influenced by various opinions coming from within Britain and from within Europe? And I refer particularly to business opinions, particularly if we do see, for example, what will be the keen area for the UK, which will be to get as much as possible on the internal market, but that not being as successful as it might be. There is the whole question of foreign investment, etc., and whether that's going to go. Will this influence, do you think, the trend?
Okay, I'm going to ask our two former civil servants. Andrew and Stephen are basically civil service still, living in Planet Remain, and not the right people to do this job. There were Dominic Cummings, I think, had this view that you had to basically take the entire civil service out if you were going to be able to deliver Brexit well, because they were just not the right people to do it. So, do you want to speak for your former colleagues?
Well, I bridle at what David said, and I don't agree with it. I don't know. In my time, civil servants did not leak, did not brief, as we're in a pro-EU way. I think both Stephen and I and all the people we worked with negotiated extremely hard and toughly on behalf of the British national interest. At the time, the British national interest was to be full-hearted members of the European Union. I think it was John Major's phrase. So we did that job, but I just don't think it's true. I also don't think it's true that those who campaigned on the Remain side would nevertheless want in any way to undermine the negotiation. To the contrary, civil servants, as a professional skill, do what the politicians tell them to, and would. So I just don't agree that, and to be all these civil servants being the product of the EU. Well, I don't know. Just go and ask some of the French, German, Spanish, Hungarian officials whether they think their British opposite numbers are product of the EU, and you'll get a dusty answer. Can I just, on the soft Brexit question? It depends entirely on Theresa May. She will decide, and I think none of us know. I mean, the financial markets have taken one view. They may be right, they may be wrong. And I don't suppose she knows precisely where she wants to end up just at the moment. But I don't think we can tell. I think it gives her the opportunity for a softer Brexit if she chooses to go for it, but we don't know whether she will.
Stephen, do you want to say anything else about civil servants?
Yeah, I don't know about leaks. I mean, successive, when one party has won an election after a long period in power of the other party, they always assume that the civil service, from Labour, when Labour got in 97, they assumed that we were all dyed-in-the-wool Tories. My experience is that in terms of personal views, people in the civil service divide very much on the same lines as the rest of the country, and I guess that the same is probably true across the civil service on this issue. And although people have personal views, I mean, if you are a civil servant, you are hardwired to want to do what the elected government of the day asks you to do. And equally, for many civil servants, whatever their personal views may be, if the one game in town is this, so this is the game. This is the game you want to be part of.
So, Gisela, do you think that the election makes softer Brexit was where the market's right?
I just can't make the connection between the two, quite frankly, because in terms of the rate of the pound, what always amazes me or amuses me in many ways, the pound goes up and the stock market goes down because so many of the FTSE 100s actually earn their money somewhere else, and therefore with the exchange rates they appear. So the pound is Mervyn King thought that before the referendum the pound was grossly overvalued anyway and needed readjusting, whatever the result was. The kind of soft heartbreak, I really dislike this term so absolutely intensely because I think it is essentially meaningless. But what I think we will need, and this comes to how to do outside bodies, for example, I would quite like to see the car manufacturers getting together, both here and the German car manufacturers, and say, how could we make the supply chain work? given that you have left. I think whilst usually the British institutions are not opening to industry lobbying the way Brussels is, I think on this occasion a lot of cross-work to that kind of lobbying as to what are the best conditions would be useful. But I just want to say one thing to you. One thing which I've learned is that the one institution that can always overcome its entire differences as long as it gets more power has always been the European Parliament. It is the most single-minded institution in that sense, because as long as they get more say, they'll agree to anything.
That's interesting. I'm not quite sure how that plays out, but that's a very interesting bargaining chip to throw in. I mean, of course, sectoral deals are one of the things that the EU 27 have said they absolutely won't countenance, that the specific sector deals for a sweetheart deal for the car industry is not on the things. That's starting cherry picking.
That should not stop you from actually working through what these things would actually look like in practice. I mean, you mentioned the pharmaceutical industry. It wasn't all that long ago that I was lobbied by every university with a medical school who was telling me that the medicine directives was completely destroying their research and everything. So, none of these things are ever black or white. It is always a question of saying where is the problem and what are the most beneficial deals. Because just remember one thing, neither the voters here nor in mainland Europe actually will appreciate any government that goes into economic self-harming. They want a deal which delivers them the best collectively.
Mark, business.
Just quickly, as a non-civil servant, I was for 9 months, but I don't normally admit to it. I disagree entirely with what Andrew said. I've dealt with civil servants. I've not come across that attitude ever. And I think this is just people wishing to continue battles that should have been stopped on June the 23rd.
So do you think there are business, to pick up Robert's point, do you think there's sort of business shocks to come? Things that we haven't sort of really taken on board that might influence the course of negotiations? I mean,
coming on to Robert's points, I've detected some really, there's still the political debate on Brexit continues. Is it a good thing, a bad thing? Will it be a success or a failure? The business, from what I can see, on June the 24th, it's right, we're out of the European Union, probably going to be out of the single market by the 1st of April 2019. What do we need to do? And remember, the loyalty of businesses is not to Britain. It is to their shareholders, their staff, their customers, the three working together. And the Bank of England has just written to financial institutions more saying, what are your Brexit plans? Which means, what will you do on a worst case scenario? And as they have to produce a worst case scenario for their office being destroyed by a tsunami, all of the executives being killed in a plane crash, rats eating through the cabling to the computer, this is a bigger risk than any of those. And businesses are being required to say to the regulator, this is what we are going to do. And it's not, this is what we're going to do to stay in Britain. It is this is what we are going to do to remain viable, to guard against risks. And the only assumption they can make is a hard Brexit. Sorry about the expression, but let's put it another way. Outside the single market, with no preferential access beyond that of North Korea. Perhaps not North Korea, I think there's...
That may not be the best country.
Well, not even that. There's a free trade agreement.
They have an FTA, so not South Korea.
The Galapagos Islands, okay. That is the only assumption that they can make. So businesses are now doing things, and they're not going to have a press conference to say, we're going to set up in X, but they're all doing it. One or two have had to say publicly what they're doing.
I'm a non-executive director of Lloyd's of London.
Lloyd's of London was the one I was going to mention.
We're going to go set up a subsidiary in Luxembourg. We have to do that. It's the only way to protect our European business.
I've got my Luxembourg tie. You haven't recognised it? Nor has anybody else. Nobody here from Luxembourg. It was a waste of time wearing it. But so businesses, and indeed AIG, are going to Luxembourg. We're seeing other announcements like that. What I'm detecting, for the most part, this is small scale. What we need to do to continue providing the service from the 1st of April 2019. The really big location decisions will come after 2019. And that will depend on what we negotiate with the European Union, what the British government does on key things like tax and regulation, and the one that is more important than any of them, and which in my view will determine the future prosperity of this country, is talent.
Okay, talent. Migration.
Migration.
As that's otherwise known. Let's have some more questions. Let's go there. Penny, Liz. And then we'll come down here. Yeah, we'll do another crop of 3. Liz.
Thanks. I'm Liz Carlin. I was a researcher here at the IFG. I'm now based mostly in Dublin, so you can probably guess what my question is going to be. So our government, right after the vote, came out and said it was going to be one of Britain's strongest allies in the 26, and we are sitting on the other side of the negotiating table. But they're in a tricky position at the moment because there's a lot of public sentiment which is quite strongly against that government position. There's a recognition that 86% of our freight comes through Britain, the North, the peace process, the border, the common travel area, and the future of the EU are all quite pressing issues for the future of the economy. And our government is also a minority government facing the prospect of an election this year, which Sinn Féin may end up becoming a minority coalition partner. So, Stephen, it was your point on narrative and on language, and that really struck me, because I think, there is this kind of narrative that that the British government is ignoring Northern Ireland, it is ignoring Ireland, it is ignoring a lot of the subnational administrations and the interests of other parties. And I was just wondering if there is really a recognition within the negotiating team, within the conversations that are happening internally, of both the risks to the subnational government, but also of the need to have some strong signalling to other countries who could potentially be partners, and who need that kind of signalling for their own domestic populations in order to be Britain's ally and make sure that the Brexit that we end up with is the best for everyone.
Okay, let's go here, just kind of in front of you.
Yeah, Tony Barber, the Financial Times. I wanted to bring you back to this point about the rejection of expertise and the suspicion of people with experience and knowledge. To what extent, in your view, is this being driven from the centre of government, that is, from Downing Street itself? And to what extent might that change as a result of the election result?
Okay, I think we've touched on that a bit, and let's just go down to there. Yeah.
Stephen, if you had to, sorry, it's Matt Dathan from The Sun.
Yeah.
Steve, if you had to put a figure on the divorce bill, what would it be? And Gisela, this morning you said you'd like to see a government with a strong majority, and said that it was unlikely that Labour would deliver that. So are you hoping to see Theresa May form a bigger majority? And is there any chance you might defect?
Okay, right. Don't feel totally obliged to answer those at Institute for Government. That's up to you. Let's do Ireland, because I think we've been having some conversations with the Irish Times, who've been very concerned that they think that basically Ireland's been a bit ignored, and Ireland is actually this sort of real flashpoint for a lot of issues, hopefully metaphorically, not literally, but that it's not getting its sort of due weight and attention in the negotiating process.
I don't know. I mean, the right things have been said. But although somebody very close to the negotiations in Brussels said to me, not a Brit, somebody working in the institution said, the British government don't care about Ireland, and I hope that isn't true. As far as the European negotiations are concerned, I saw Barnier a few weeks ago. Barnier dealt a lot with Ireland when he was the commissioner responsible for the structural funds. So he has Ireland and the welfare of Ireland and the need to come to a workable arrangement in terms both of people and trade very quite high on his agenda. But I think in the referendum campaign, these issues were rather neglected. We've suddenly woken up to Gibraltar. Some of us were talking about Gibraltar during the campaign. So I think there almost certainly needs to be pressure on the British government, because at the moment my sense, but I'm obviously not involved in it. My sense is that the commitments to Ireland are at the level of generality rather than anything else.
Can I just make the cynical political point? Britain should, of course, have Northern Ireland's interests very close to its heart, and at the end of the day, I think will. It doesn't need to just at the moment, because the EU has to deliver a solution on that side, because they have Ireland and will be a member of the EU 27. So I mean, behind the scenes, I'm not surprised that the British government is saying, well, EU, you come up with some solutions. You be the demandeur for this, not us. I mean, it's all a question, who needs this as part of the final package? But at the end of the day, the reality, the political reality is that Britain needs it as much as the EU side needs it. And I think in the later stages of the negotiation, there will be an agreement. I'm very confident of that on the Irish border, because both sides absolutely need there to be one.
So Gisela, from a vote leave perspective, and vote leave, one of the things they were asked about was, would this be a problem? No. Would Ireland be a problem? No. I mean, so what's the sort of feasible solution from a sort of leave perspective around Ireland that doesn't wreck all this cross-border trade that's grown up, the fact that economically it's sort of much more integrated than any other part of the UK with the EU?
I mean, that's where it comes back. If you have the political will to make it work, you can make it work. And if am I right that Barnier actually was the rapporteur when Ireland joined the European Union? Mm-hmm. And therefore he actually has a very close personal interest to make that work. And I remember having lots of conversation with Theresa Villiers at the time, who was then the Northern Ireland Secretary. And that's where sort of, in many ways took my cue from on how you can make this.
So what do you think it looks like? What does it look like? Does it look like a sort of, virtual border? Do we get customs checks? Do you do what?
Well, I would have thought you'd have to operate on a virtual border, yeah.
There are two solutions. Either the border is around the island of Ireland, or the border is around the island of England, Scotland and Wales.
I think
those are the only two solutions.
But in
it has to be one or the other.
Yeah, but in terms of the trade, you can actually do a lot of tracking as a virtual border.
I remember the days when cows in Northern Ireland would cross the border at least once every 24 hours in order to get, every day, 7 days a week, in order to get the. It's quite difficult to track that border.
Okay, let's come on to the money question. I'm going to come to expertise last. Divorce bill, size. I'm very interested in your answer, Gisela, but I'm very interested in everybody else's. I'm very interested in what do you think the minimum the Europeans will settle for, and what do you think is the maximum that Theresa, let's assume she has an increased majority, she gets what she wants from the election. What do you think the maximum is she can get away with presenting to the British people in terms of a divorce bill from the EU? Because it's the thing that wasn't mentioned at all in the Brexit white paper. We didn't mention it in our letter, except we said something a bit Weasley, which I said that's about the money, and everybody else said it, really. But we've been very, very reticent to say anything very much about this other than keep our options open. What do you think? Where do you think the money's going to end up?
Well, you're going to have a massive discussion, which may
I think it's a bill,
and the opening negotiations are going to define the size of the envelope. Which is why I said at the beginning, what I thought the referendum was about was you stop an automaticity of contributions. That's going to be the key thing, and I think you will have a phased things you've made commitments to, but it's part of that whole package of what
Jill,
that's what you're going to argue about.
You don't want to look at it. I mean, obviously, some people will want to look at it as a bill, but it isn't a single bill. It's made up of lots of different components, which will be looked at in different terms. To some extent, we will want to pay money in to get things we want, participation in Erasmus, for example, or in the R&D.
But that's not the exit bill, that's the future
There will be some
partnership.
other things we will want to we will want property to pay for, because a responsible government does. I mean, the pension bill, but that's a 50-year bill. It's a small amount of money each year. And then there are the payments we need to make in the coming 2 years, which are just part of the normal part of payments. And then there's the really contentious stuff is, are we committed to paying for those policy choices which we have signed up to already, but which the payments go on after 2019? And that, I think, will be a very contentious political choice. But there isn't a single bill, and I think it's been very unhelpful on both sides, well, particularly on the EU side, to say, oh, it's going to be 50 billion, it's going to be 40 billion, it's going to be whatever it is.
60 billion.
Because it's... 60 billion. Because it isn't, there are all sorts of different financial envelopes, and there will need to be a solution on, and most of them are not actually that contentious. There are a few which are deeply contentious.
And the House of Lords was just sort of saying in one of the House of Lords reports, saying, oh, we don't need to pay anything at all. It's sort of the other side of that envelope.
But that's
so
silly,
just,
you know.
Well, said no legal obligation to pay anything, didn't they? Stephen, do you?
I think it would be rash to put a figure on it, but I agree with Andrew's analysis. I mean, if you look at the commitments we make under the structural funds during the present financial period, there's if there is some kind of phasing, we might not, but we might decide that we're going to continue to make some contribution because it's in our interest to help the economies of Eastern and Central Europe, not least because we will want their support in terms of the eventual deal we do. Those are things that the government will have to weigh up.
Okay, so hard to tell a final number. I think that's a very clever ways of presenting it that we're going to see. Just quickly, do you want to come back on Tony's point about expertise, about this? Is there going to be a change on expertise?
I mean, my sense, but Tony, you'll know better than me, but my sense is that this does come from within Downing Street. I mean, I think you have, a very narrow gate into Downing Street guarded by two Cerberuses, if that's the right term. And
whether Scylla and
Charybdis, maybe, whether that aspect of it changes, I think is questionable.
Okay, let's do one quick further round. I'm very conscious we're getting up against time. We've got a crop of people here in the front, so let's try and take all of you. And then if people have got time to stay for another, but I'm very conscious Gisela needs to get away. Yes.
My name's Caroline Wedmore and I'm from the Department for International Trade. We've spoken a bit about the contingency plans which businesses are either considering or even putting into effect already. So my question is there a way in which the government can configure those negotiation strategy to give as much certainty as possible, or is it just something that we need to accept that it won't be certain for some time?
Okay, that's a good question. Quick questions, even better. Thank you very much.
Thomas Cole, Open Britain. Do you think the Greek bailout negotiations the summer of 2015 will give any guidance as to how the UK Brexit talks will go?
Okay, and yes, in the front. Could you just wait for the microphone?
It's Masato Kimura, Japanese freelance journalist. My question is about French presidential elections. So I think, do you think snap election could boost populist movement in France? And do you think whether Theresa May consider this effect before announcement?
Okay. Okay, is there anything that the government can do? Or maybe, Mark, you'd like to see that would give certainty to people? Is there anything we can do about the way the negotiations are structured?
For me, if you think the government can say the answer is no, and I've been, some of my own members saying you should be more positive and reassure businesses. So really, what am I going to tell them? The only reassurance I would give is assume a worst case scenario, but hope that it's not. And a lot of the work we're doing, policy-wise, is precisely along those lines. And the government has been very receptive. This is what we would like. And if we get all of this, well, that's great. Some people, even they might be in the process of moving to Berlin or wherever, might stop moving. If there is a definite something different. So the words mean nothing. So, a minister can say, we're going to have free trade agreements with 18 countries, you should be working on the assumption. No, you can't. You can work only on substance. But, I don't think there's a problem there. I think the government understands the position of business very well, and business understands what government can and can't deliver. I think what worries me slightly is that some businesses are not taking this seriously. They might have been reassured by the odd ministerial voice that it'll be fine. You've no need to worry. The financial services businesses are being required by their regulator to have plans and to implement them. And I'm worried about some smaller businesses that think they haven't got a problem, not perhaps realising their supply chain does cross the channel 7 times, and thinking that their Polish workers will be as accessible after we leave as they are now.
So that's quite interesting, because the government should be communicating uncertainty rather than certainty.
But we don't want scaremongering, absolutely not. We want realism on this. And I think businesses, the mantra of preparing for the worst and hoping for the best and doing what we can on the policy side to get the best solution. is the right way forward.
But look, this is looking into this room. This is this generation's opportunity to actually redraw the rules on how nation states relate to each other, how a lot of policies in these countries are going to work, and you're doing it in peacetime conditions, which no generation before has had this opportunity. There's a whole lot of stuff out there which we have not yet done, and we will do it differently. That is the whole point. So I think the next years you will have the opportunity of national renewal and deal with things. You said something earlier about talent. Okay, to which you then said migration. Let me say to you, I'm a Birmingham MP, the fastest growing, youngest city in Europe. 40% of the population is under the age of 30. If you've got a government policy that every time it faces skill shortages, brings that skill in from abroad, does not train its own young people, you're causing yourself problems in right front of your doorstep. And I think, and that now means that why are so many of our communities not resilient? Now, some will say, why didn't you do this whilst you were in the EU? Well, we didn't do it. That's all I can tell you. Is then there are the problems, and this is the massive chance to actually do that. So don't be hampered down by certainty. Life ain't certain, other than at some stage you're going to die. That's about the only thing that is certain.
Okay.
You may have
That and
missed
taxes.
So
Yeah.
use it. Use it.
I used to do fishery negotiations. The fishermen are probably the most difficult group to bring along with you. The way you do it is by involving them in the negotiations. Their hands need to be in the blood. One criticism I would make so far of this administration is that it hasn't tried to get all the different groups, but particularly the businesses which will be affected, involved in a way that they feel that they're participants in the negotiation. And I think that does need to change, and that's the way you can make the negotiations really successful. The best strategy is talking to businesses all the way, and all the parties who are going to be impacted, talking to them, getting them in, consulting them, giving them some information about where they're getting to, because then all of us will be in it together. The country will come together if we feel we're all negotiating together. If this is something which is done by a very small, just essentially by number 10 and imposed upon the country, I think actually it'll be much more difficult to sell.
So very quickly on that, Stephen and Andrew, any lessons from the Greek negotiations in 2015?
If you mean, do they go down to the wire, then certainly yes. But I come back to the question about how much certainty can you have? The answer is not very much. I mean, you can create an atmosphere in which you can demonstrate to people in Britain that the government are serious about the outcome and recognise the realities, which include the need for implementation transition period. But you have to think about leverage. I mean, Boris Johnson said the other week, well, look at what Margaret Thatcher achieved on the British rebate. The fact is, for 4 years, she got absolutely nowhere, or pretty much nowhere. When she achieved the rebate, it was because the European community was running out of money and they could only get more money if she agreed. We're not in that situation. We have to recognise our leverage in this negotiation is very limited. I think at the end of the day, it is in our partners' interest to do, as part of our exiting and for the next stage, some kind of free trade deal with us. I wouldn't care to predict what our situation will be on trade in services, let alone financial services at this point. And if they choose to be very tough with us, they can screw us on those things.
So just on the last question, just as we close, we've got presidential elections in France where almost everybody seems to be around 20%, plus or minus the rounding errors. We have elections in Germany where there was a Schulz bounce, there now seems to be a Schulz de-bounce or whatever, but it'll either be Schulz or Merkel. We have our elections. So just a sort of final run down the panel as we end. What's it going to look like in October when we're through? What of these might make a difference to the outcome of the Brexit negotiations? Mark, do you want to say, do you think Germany, France going to make any sort of difference?
When you look at the French electoral system, it is bizarre. You're going to finish up with perhaps votes of 22, 22, 21, 21. You might as well toss a coin if you're not careful. You've got the possibility of an extreme left against Marine Le Pen. So anything could happen. It's a very odd system. Dangerous things, elections. But we've got big elections coming up. I think ours at the moment is the most predictable in terms of the result. But I think there's a bit of election fatigue, or election and referendum fatigue growing. I agree entirely. I think it may have been Stephen or Andrew, indeed Gisela as well. This is up to the British Prime Minister, the French President and the German Chancellor to find a way forward, and who those three people are when they've got mandates to speak. And remember, the Germans can take a long time to form a government.
I mean, if Marine Le Pen were elected president of France, clearly the cards go up in the air. And if France were to vote on a referendum to come out of the European Union, then the future of the European Union is engraved out. Let us assume, for the sake of argument, that we have Macron or Schulz or Merkel by the end of the year. What will their main objective be? Their main objective will be the survival and success in particular of the European Union. That will be the governing impetus behind their position in the negotiation. It won't be what can we do to help the British, it will be what do we need to do for the future prosperity of the European Union with Britain out of it.
Andrew?
So they'll be tough.
Well, in the accession negotiations back in 1971, 1972, in the end, the deal was done between Edward Heath and Pompidou. That was where the power lay. But of course, outside of that, all sorts of mini deals had been done. So, as it were, with the New Zealand Prime Minister saying what the amount of butter and the amount of lamb he had to get in. So, what will happen in this case is all sorts of mini deals will be needed on Ireland, on Gibraltar, on all sorts of other things where other interest groups will be there. And then at the very end of the day, the really big question will get done essentially between the German Chancellor and Theresa May, with the French president having a say, but a lesser say, because the power has changed in Europe, in continental Europe, since 1972. So at the end of the day, we're relying on whoever becomes prime minister after this election to be a tough negotiator. And one of the things which I'm actually reasonably encouraged about is that one thing everybody agrees about Theresa May, as we've seen in the last few days, she's a tough negotiator.
And does it matter who's on the German side, whether it's Schulz or Merkel?
Not in the long run. I think to begin with, if you had a Schulz victory, you probably would have a greater priority of sort of some of the European institutions, but then the German economic interests will prevail. And the week we triggered Article 50, it was one of the annual Königswinter conferences in Berlin. And it was actually that moment when even the most Anglophile Germans were saying, you are actually leaving. You know, there was this process of where they were thinking something would happen, that it would not happen. And once the realism set in, I think economic interests will trump everything. And as Stephen said, also to maintaining the integrity of the European Union, that's going to be really key to them.
So final question. There's a quiz show called Deal or No Deal. So what do you think? 2 years' time, we're sitting here, will we be discussing the deal, or will we all be saying, well, it was always probably inevitable that talks would break down?
Well, the clock will go to midnight and probably have to be stopped in the usual European way, but deal, I would say.
Deal? Andrew, deal or no deal?
There will be a deal, and it'll be renegotiated 5 years later, as every single deal we've ever had with Europe has always been renegotiated.
Mark, deal or no deal?
A deal, but with a lot of fudge around the outside of it, with things to be settled after the deal.
Okay, fudgy deal, Gisela? Deal, no deal?
It'll be a deal. It may be like when we had the negotiations with Turkey, that they said midnight was actually 1 hour ahead because we were doing it according to UK time rather than Brussels time. But it will be a deal. But can I just say, you saying, and it will be renegotiated 5 years later, is exactly why there are a whole lot of people out there who go and say, oh, you know, there's a whole bunch of civil servants there who just pretend to know they're going to negotiate.
No, because we will get a better deal. We'll get a better deal 5 years later.
Okay, you heard it here first, or whatever. I don't know what the deal equivalent of a never-endum is, but anyway. So could I just get you all to thank our panel for engaging so much in the conversation? And despite the election, there are a whole range of Brexit-related events and publications coming out from IFG, so please follow us on #IFGBrexit. Thank you very much.